Let me call to order the meeting of the San Ramon Planning Commission for Tuesday, April 2nd, 2024. We have a roll call, please.
Commissioner Ahmed, Commissioner Alpert,
Here.
Commissioner Curtis,
Present.
Vice Chair Kuznick. Here. And Chair Wallace.
I'm here. Thank you. Mr. Driscoll, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
Flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, item 4 on the agenda tonight is public comment. Public comment at this point is for matters that are not agendized for tonight's meeting. Do we have any written communications?
Written public comment received from Cameron Klotz as part of the public record and was provided to the commission prior to the meeting. We also received one speaker card from Cameron Klotz.
Okay. Come on down.
I'll kind of bounce in and out of what I provided in writing. Basically why I'm here today, because a dispute of an interpretation for a sign ordinance, and conceptual signs have been proposed to go on the corner of Crow Canyon and Camino Remote, where the former US Bank building is. There's a new use that the purpose that we're seeking here is like a community benefit truly, and especially at a time when we're bringing so many houses online, I think it's very opportunistic opportunity that we have here. So, questions that
Oh, thank you for your comments. Do you have any other speaker cards?
We have no other speaker cards.
Can we close public comment? Next item on the agenda is additions and revisions. We have none. Item 6 is the consent calendar. We have none. Item 7 is approval of the minutes from the March 19th, 2024 meeting. Hopefully, everybody's had a chance to look at the minutes and see if there's anything they wish to comment on, change, or move to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from the March 19th, 2024 Planning Commission meeting.
I'll go ahead and second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes from the March 19th, 2024 meeting. As soon as the appropriate button comes up on our iPads, let's vote. Okay, the minutes from the March 19th meeting are approved 5-0. Next on the calendar is continued items after closing a public hearing. We have none. Item 8 is continued items, open public hearing. We have none. Item number 10, public hearings, new items. We have none. Item 11, non-public hearing action items. We are out. Item number 12, finally we get something. Study session, commissioner reports. Okay, item 12.1 is a study session on objective design and development standards. And objectively speaking, Ms. Yee, could you take the podium?
I can. Hi, thank you and good evening. I'm here today to actually introduce our consultant. Michael Gibbons from Mintier Harnish is going to be providing the presentation this evening on staff's behalf. We've been working with Mintier Harnish on the general plan update as well as the housing element update, and now moving into these objective design standards. And so this evening, I will go ahead and just pass it on to Michael for him to provide our presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, Chair. Good evening, Commissioners. A pleasure to see you all again. Last time I was here was in February. So it's a pleasure to be back here and provide you all a follow-up on the hard work we've been at. There we go. Does that work? Perfect. So here's an outline of what we're hoping to cover this evening. This is really a follow-up to the February meeting, where we first presented this concept of objective standards, and we had daylighted some initial standards for mixed use. But this evening, hoping to really bring you up to date on what we've been working on, show you some of that work, provide some example graphics as to what you can expect as we move through this process, show you next steps, and then open it up for a discussion and feedback. So I'll briefly touch on this, but we spent the last meeting really kind of honing in on what objective design standards are. But essentially, a standard is a regulation that is objective versus a guideline which is subjective. So what is objective? So objective is can be readily compared, it can be measurable, it is verifiable by reference or known criteria. And really what it is it provides certainty. Standards provide certainty. Why are they important? Well, they establish measurable and quantifiable design that not only helps to increase the production of housing or of land uses that are desirable, but it also helps streamline those, which ends up producing really additional housing, in this case, being that we're proposing these design standards for residential. And really the reason why we're here this evening is really the state of California is requiring that any guidelines, or should I say, the state is requiring that cities convert any guidelines into objective standards, and essentially saying that any guideline or any sort of standard or regulation that is not objective can't really be enforced for certain projects. And really the core of this issue really has to come down to streamlining and facilitating the development of housing. What the state has found is that a lot of jurisdictions have, through implementing and trying to enforce guidelines or subjective, is that it holds up the development process. And so the idea is that creating standards that create certainty but flexibility would streamline that process. This also is being really driven by the recent general plan and housing element update. There are goals and policies within each of those documents that call for this project to take place and to adopt these standards for residential and for mixed-use development. So when we talked last, we had proposed some ideas on how to address this. And what we've come up with and what we're proposing is a set of standards that would be applicable at a minimum to all residential and all mixed-use development citywide. Now, these standards, it was important based on the feedback received from the commission that these standards reflect past practices and capture a lot of the effort that has gone into prior amendments to your zoning regulations and prior specific plans. There was also the important to look back at prior typical conditions of approval. So the conditions of approval that you set. So let's take a look at those and incorporate those into a standards that we're not having to continue to put those in conditions. And it really, what our charge is to take the design ideas and the design guidelines and convert as many of those that would be applicable citywide to residential as possible. And here are just a couple of examples or kind of the major themes that objective design standards typically cover. So as opposed to a development standard, which is talking about setbacks or height, design is really getting at types of building materials, facade layout, different fenestration and roof lines. So here is, again, that's kind of a brief of the objective standards, but here's where we are today. So in 2023, we had a successful adoption of your general plan housing element. And this past February, we were before you presenting this idea of design standards, hoping and soliciting feedback. And since then, our team has been hard at work with your planning staff at starting to develop these standards. And we started by looking at, as per your direction, standards and guidelines that already exist in the city. And so tonight, what we're hoping to do is provide you an update, show you some of these standards, and really open the door for a dialogue as to areas that we should continue to focus on. These guidelines that will, or these standards that we'll present this evening are just as a starting point. They are, and we will continue to develop and bolster these standards, but we wanted to update you at least to where we're at on the current process. So being that we, well, here, so our approach started with looking at compiling all of the existing guidelines and standards that exist through your zoning regulations and through in your specific plans. So we compiled a total of 73 pages, at least on our end. I think in the staff report, it was over 100 standards and guidelines that we compiled. And that was the most comprehensive list of all of these design standards and guidelines citywide that was put together. What we then did is we identified where those standards came from, their specific location, and put that into matrices. After documenting and compiling all of these standards, then our team went through the process of identifying which ones we felt could be reasonably converted into an objective standard. We then converted as many of those guidelines as possible into standards, and then selected all of those that we felt were relevant to residential and mixed-use development and refined them with the assistance of city staff. We worked down from a total of 73 pages down to around 40. And we ended up with this right side of the matrix that was in the staff report. So we have here the page, and whether or not we can make this specific standard or guideline objective, and then our initial pass at making it objective. And what we found is, in general, we were able to pull out existing and convert existing guidelines to standards that covered the following areas. So massing and articulation, building materials, roof lines, fenestration. And I wanted to point out some of these examples as to kind of the process that we are going through with your staff. And so on the left side, or under the current San Ramon guideline, we have an example guideline that we pulled from the San Ramon Village specific plan. We've identified that. We identified it as a standard that would be applicable, that could be applicable and applied citywide for multifamily and mixed use. And we took a pass at making it objective. And so there was some interpretation that had to take place. But this is as an example, this would be the objective standard equivalent to the guideline that exists today. So in here we have some objective standards. So 20 feet, we have 20%. We're using very clear language, objective language, as opposed to some of the subjective language that we would typically find in a guideline, which the state is really trying to prevent. Here is another example of another standard or another guideline that we have gone through the process of converting. And these are really here for illustrative purposes. And the standard that we're trying to show on the right side is a type of standard, is a style of standard. And it's a kind of, you get to pick what you want to implement. And so we can craft these types of standards in a multitude of ways. You can say, pick one of the following, two of the following. Now, that's still it's objective because it's measurable, quantifiable, but it still allows a flexibility on the developer or the applicant to really pick which option is going to be most applicable. So this is a way that we can really craft these standards strategically to ensure flexibility, but also certainty. And then within the table, we've also converted some guidelines into standards where we've left it kind of open-ended, and where we're hoping that we could have a room for discussion or feedback. And so that's kind of illustrated in B here, where we have placeholders for distance or height. And again, this is kind of an optional standard where you can pick one of the following, or you'll have to provide all of the following. I think what we've worked to is a set of standards that we feel are a good starting point before you. What we will do, and based on feedback this evening and additional work with city staff, is we will refine those standards further, and we will supplement them with additional standards that we will craft. When the compiled document of all of those standards is finished, we will then go through the process of creating 3D graphics for these standards to ensure that they are easily articulated and understandable. And here are just a couple of examples of the graphics that we will be preparing. This is just for illustrative purposes, but it shows 3D massing. Here's with call outs. So we will use these as much as possible through the standards and through the final deliverable. When we talk about streetscapes, we'll try to articulate that as best as possible. in a rendering such as this. We can do different styles as well, but really the intent is to convey what the standard is requiring. So I've touched on it, but really this is a follow-up. It was important that the commission very early on in this process expressed that they wanted to stay updated through this process. So that's what we're doing. We're providing you an update as to where we're at in our strategy. As mentioned, we will continue to refine these standards. We will supplement them with additional standards. And then we will refine them with your feedback and community input. Eventually, then these will go to City Council for adoption. And at this point, we're anticipating this being a standards that would be adopted by resolution. So they would be a standalone set of standards that would be applicable to all multifamily and mixed-use development citywide. So I will hand it back to the chair if there are any questions at this time.
Are you going to put yourself at our mercy?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so to make this efficient, since it's a study session, I'm going to open it up for questions and comments if you want. So who wants to go first? Commissioner Alpert looks like he's ready to rock and roll.
No, thank you, Michael. I appreciate you coming back very much. Could you describe when it's done, what it will be? Will be a standalone document modified to our existing document? Could you just expand on how that's going to work?
So as of now, what we're anticipating is a standalone document that would be adopted by resolution. We would include language in there with assistance from city attorney as to the applicability. But in essence, what we're as the city and what we as a consultant team is we're suggesting that these be applied citywide. So any new multifamily development or mixed use development would have to comply with these standards. This would really come down to city staff to ensure that all of these standards are being met through the existing process of plan check. And it would be on the onus of the developer, the applicant, to also come up with or to demonstrate that they're complying with all of these standards.
Okay, and then that makes sense. So will we be needing to touch the general plan or the specific plans, or this will live on top of them? I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to understand.
So definitely not the general plan. This is implementing the general plan in state law. The specific plan discussion, we're still discussing that. There are a multitude of ways that we can handle that with direction from city attorney. We can provide you a better answer. As of at this point, it is not our intent to modify the specific plans.
Okay, that makes sense too. And then you said this, I just want to just make sure I did catch it right. This only applies to residential or mixed use with residential as part of it, but not commercial or office. Is that right? Yeah.
Correct. So specifically multifamily and mixed use projects that include residential.
Okay. And then maybe this is a question for later. Diagrams versus wording, how do those play together or not? Are they supposed, I assume they're supposed to match each other, but sometimes a picture you can not really get it from a 3D picture, but
Sir,
so how does this work with pictures and words?
Yeah, so we'll really have to go back to that section in your zoning regulations. So I would defer to those. Typically, there is language that states that figures and graphics are for illustrative purposes only, and that it is the actual text that would that is enforceable, and that is typical language. I would defer to city staff on that, but for at least our purposes, it's just for figurative. It's to help just demonstrate it further.
Okay.
We would default to the standard and the
Okay.
text itself.
I think there's two more questions. Do you envision this document also include a table of contents? Because some of the words in even some of the samples, you could discuss, like I saw once that adjacent buildings. I don't know what adjacent might mean, or somebody might think it's different than something else. So do you envision at some point a glossary for the company this document?
Absolutely. And that structure yet, we know that we know certain things that we want to address, massing and articulation. How we're going to structure that, we haven't developed that yet, but certainly it will be a standalone document under a cover adopted by resolution. And we will include a glossary in there. Yes, there are going to be a lot of terms that are new. And so ensuring that those are well-defined is extremely important to us.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And then my last question on places where we're giving them pick one of or two of or three of, under state law, are applicants allowed to say, I don't like any of these, but I'm going to offer something else that staff can either say it's good or no, we don't like those, go back to one of the four that we wrote up. Is that allowed?
Absolutely. They would just have to go through a discretionary process.
Okay.
So this is the intent is to be streamlined, to say, hey, developer, we're giving you these options. We're comfortable with this now. We're being flexible now. You be flexible. If there's the desire to deviate, then it would go through a discretionary process. What that discretionary process is would depend.
Okay, helpful. Thank you. Thank you. That's it for now, I think.
Commissioner Curtis?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. So I have a question. So I'm looking at one of the standards that talks about mixed use structures with non-residential ground floor. You shall design the ground floor with a minimum 15-foot ceiling height to accommodate variety of land uses. So what happens if that building changes what it's using it for? So let's say the non-residential all of a sudden becomes residential, then which of the design standards does it follow? If it's no longer a non-residential, they convert it to residential, let's say, but they've built it out as non-residential, do they have to switch the standards then to match what they're building? So for example, the city of San Jose is taking some of their multifamily mixed use areas. And since they're losing businesses, they're converting the bottom stories that used to be commercial to residential. So what would happen then in terms of the objective standards at that point? Because if the objective standards were different for residential versus commercial in a multi-use building, which standards would they have to follow?
So I may have to follow up. I may have to follow up. Are you talking about like just an internal like tenant improvement, or this would be a residential coming into an existing commercial space?
I'm talking, so lately, so the city of San Jose has had multi-use, mixed-use buildings. The bottom stories were supposed to be there to use for commercial space. The commercial space isn't being utilized, so they're converting it to residential space instead.
Right.
So it's no longer commercial. But in here, we're talking about non-residential ground floors would have to have a certain height of floors, whatever.
Yeah.
If the standards were in conflict is what I'm asking. If it just hypothetically, what standards would they follow? Residential or the original, which was the commercial or non-residential?
I'll say that we certainly wouldn't require the building to be lowered to comply with that standard, but I will default to Cindy.
Maybe I can just, we haven't talked about all the hypotheticals, but I think in a situation where it's an existing building, these standards are meant to apply to new construction. And so in that situation, where it's a conversion of existing commercial space to residential, we wouldn't apply that standard to a remodel or tenant improvement. But the expectation is that these standards apply to new design and new construction, so that when somebody's looking to develop a project and they have the intention of having commercial on the ground floor, then they would follow the requirement of the 15-foot minimum ceiling heights. If they were to convert in the future, we would allow for the building to remain as originally designed. If they do have to redevelop the building and demolish, let's say, and then rebuild a portion of it to accommodate for some of those new uses, then maybe the new construction part of these standards would apply, but we wouldn't retroactively require that the buildings be modified to meet these standards if the building already exists.
So then the question is, how long is something new?
How long is something, once it's constructed and issued like a certificate of occupancy, we typically consider that having been constructed and no longer new.
So then could somebody change the standards at that point? Since it's now certified, they built within the standards and they want to remodel the, say, the facade of it. Could they change it and then not have to worry about the standards?
It's likely that they would be able to do that without having to then comply. I think in situations like San Jose where the intent had always been for mixed use to with the ground floor design and the upper floors as residential. Most of those buildings go in with the intent of being commercial. At some point, the developer is going to decide if it's been vacant for quite some time and they need to reevaluate it, that they'll ask for a development plan amendment or a new application with the city to convert. And then at that time, we would evaluate, what the building code requirements are and what the design standards are. But typically, once something is constructed and issued occupancy, even if it's not a business is not moved in, it would still be considered having been granted occupancy and built.
Just to pile on that topic, some of you may remember the North Camino Ramon specific plan actually had provisions related to this. The important aspect in terms of the commercial floor plate heights was the ability to accommodate commercial in the future. It also envisioned that it may take a long time before the commercial area develops to the point where there's enough critical mass. And so there were provisions that allowed for lofts and residential to go in the interim. And so this is a similar concept to that. But again, the key takeaway is you need to be able to have the design to accommodate the commercial. It can go the other way with residential very easily, but it's the commercial side that's the problem. Right? So, cool.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, how about the other people on the side here?
Hi, Mike. Thank you. Thank you for doing this. I have a question. Who decides if the standard now is objective enough? So for example, if I'm looking at this one example right here, the corner building should have distinct architectural features and defined building entrances at the corner to animate in the intersection and facilitate pedestrian flow. And then if you go to the objective standard, it talks about 4 feet height and 2 feet from the corner. Who is deciding that? Like, who is giving that input? And where is that coming from? That 4 feet is good for the pedestrian flow? Or
So those were examples. So that was us taking it and providing numbers that we feel as your consultant that we feel are adequate, but ultimately you and the city council.
well, I wouldn't know that. The cities. Okay. How would I decide whether that's enough? I don't know. I cannot sit here and tell you that that makes the standard objective enough. And if that particular change still achieves the standard that was originally there.
Right. So
I
sure.
don't have the sort of skill set to do so.
So then that's what we're proposing that we feel is adequately addressing and converting and capturing the intent of that guideline and converting that into an objective standard. We'll, of course, refine those with your city staff. Those numbers and what is objective we're looking at, or what is a standard versus we are looking at something that is objective. So establishing a distance, a hard number that is objective, and that is measurable. So when we have kind of these open-ended guidelines, such as the one that you're referring to, we are taking some liberties when we're drafting that standard, but it is there as a starting point that we can further refine.
I think one of the things that's also been helpful in the past as we get further into these is to have samples of architecture. We had a series of workshops years ago about density and mass and what that looks like at different levels. And so the concepts of roofline articulation are pretty straightforward. As to what is an aesthetically pleasing dimension is a little harder to quantify. And that's why you end up with a minimum or a range to allow people to do more if that's what the design calls for. But it's a challenge because again, everybody has a different opinion as to what the first standard said.
That's right.
Aesthetically pleasing, what does that mean and to whom? So we're trying to create flexibility and opportunities for people to create an aesthetic that matches the aesthetic for the city.
And is there like a review by the state once it's done?
No,
No, it just stops here.
no, this is a local standard applied locally.
Okay.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Kusin.
So I have a variety of comments that I jotted as I was reading through this, and I'm not sure if to the extent that you want to go into that minutia, but I'm happy to provide it. But this is my first question I'd like to address to our city staff, which is, could I get some feedback on the state of the North Camino Ramon specific plan? Because as my recollection, when we were going through all the housing elements and so forth, that it was like, hang tight, we're going to be getting rid of this soon. It's going to be on the chopping block. So is it
Yeah,
not?
actually, so the North Camino Ramon specific plan only exists in history now. It no longer applies as a specific plan in the city. So we've replaced the North Camino Ramon specific plan, at least in that area, with just your standard zoning code and zoning map applies to the North Camino Ramon specific plan. Why we're showing standards from the North Camino Ramon specific plan is because a lot of the specific plan had references to mixed use and multifamily. And it had a lot of good information in there about how to articulate buildings and design buildings, but they weren't necessarily worded in objective language. And so because the objective design and development standards are going to apply citywide, we're taking language that the city has adopted in the past and then kind of using that as sort of the basis of how we move forward with citywide standards. And so the bones were pretty good in the North Camino Ramon specific plan. They just didn't have the specificity that is required. And so we're starting with those, and you can see where we've taken our starting point. And then really that column at the end is where we're trying to move towards. And that last column is actually how the final adopted guidelines will look like. Is that column then adopted, and you'll be able to follow. These apply to mixed use, these apply to residential, and then and use that like a menu when designing your project.
Thank you. Thank you. That is helpful. So if when I read the agenda, it was to provide feedback on this stuff. So I have notes on this as we go. So ready? Okay. Pardon me.
If I can ask you, are your notes related to the specifics of the standards? Okay.
Well, some are questions if
Okay, the reason I asked is because I understood this was illustrative rather than here's what we're proposing to do.
okay, fair enough. So, how would staff like me to, do you want specific comments or just back to the board you go?
If there are standards if there are guidelines that we have converted to standards that you feel would be appropriate to apply citywide, then that would be great for us to know. We've picked out the ones that we think are at least as a good starting point. But if there are specific themes that you would like us to work into the final standards, then that would be beneficial.
Okay, I'm going to reference one specifically because I think this has a broader range, and I'm on page 2 of 5 on the staff report. Packet page 10. And it is the issue of the commercial establishment access, where it reads as the standard. I'll read slowly. Pardon me. Entryways for commercial establishments shall be located along pedestrian pathways. And what struck me when I read this was this is a mixed use application, And I felt like this is where we got into some disagreement, particularly around the Iron Horse Village and the work-live units. That there was a sense that, you know, having front doors facing a very busy street was not a good idea. Yet, as a mixed use, the plan called for having front doors facing a busy street. So what I'm saying is, I would like to see us try to add a clause or some language that would not burden the non-work live units with this same, you know, facing the pathways as the commercial ones. And I will let you to craft that, but I think that I'd like to see that, you know, taken on as something that helps prevent a future issue.
So making that distinction then between the, understood.
Yeah. And let me think, I think the other ones are less, I think they're important, but yeah, the others can be tweaked. I had some issues about recreational space, defining them on multifamilies, because it talked about a minimum size, and then on the next section, it defined more specifically about recreation areas. And but again, if we're not down into those nitty gritties, that I will leave that into your capable hands.
Yeah, I mean, well, let me ask you this. What is the thought process of specifying minimum areas for open space or recreational space within?
You know, I think as a first pass at this, one possibility might tie it to density, which is, you know, there's a correlation between the number of people and how big, for example, we talk about a tot lot frequently on developments, and that, you know, if you're going to have a very, very large multifamily building, one small tot lot with 3 swings is not going to, it'll meet the letter of the law, but for those families waiting to get their kids on the swing, 3 is not enough. So maybe some proportionality.
And we've successfully crafted language like that for other jurisdictions that actually that regulation actually really lends itself well to the option types of standard, where we can list out a multitude of amenities that you feel would be important for a mixed user. And then we could say the developer shall provide 4 or 5, depending on number of units or square footage. But certainly, no, that's great feedback.
And I think the other ones, I will yield on the other ones. They are much more specific than I think I was led to believe for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
I don't really have any questions. The issue is going to be farther down the road. It's one thing to create a quote objective close quote standard, which is it has to be 3 feet this way, 4 feet, corners have to be 90 degrees. The issue, I think, for some of us at least, is what does that mean in the real world? You know, is that the right number? Should it be 5 feet or 3 feet? That's going to be the hard part. And I would guess that you're probably going to come up with an average somewhere in the median, not too small, not too big, something like that. But, you know, it's understandable why we have to create objective standards. Otherwise, we get sued if we do something developer doesn't like. Nobody likes to be sued. So anyway, I look forward to your next work product. Any other comments?
May I follow up with that?
Sure.
One of the benefits of actually adopting these under resolution is it does allow for the ease of amendment. Whereas adopting it and codifying it within the regulations, you have to go through the formal amendment process and it takes longer. So we can be a little bit more flexible as these are being implemented initially, being that there will be some likely some growing pains and some adjustment that might be needed.
Well, okay. Now can you explain to me what you meant? If we adopt guidelines by a resolution, simply an act of the city council passing a legislative act. Now, if you mean if we were to codify it in a part of a general plan or B specific plan, now you're talking about a different can of worms. But you're just talking about stuff that the city council can do on its own, right?
Do you? Yeah.
So, cities have the option to adopt by ordinance or resolution these objective design standards. I think it was SB 35 that just says that we have to adopt objective standards. It doesn't say necessarily how the city has to do that, but by adopting it by resolution, it gives us the ability, maybe the first project that comes in, we realize, we don't really like 4 feet. Maybe 5 feet should have been the standard. And so we can go back through this process and amend that specific language in the resolution that adopted the standards to modify that and then adjust for future projects. State law only requires that we have those design standards identified, and that when a project comes in, that we can point to those standards that have been developed so that the developer at the time the application is submitted can look to the standards that have been adopted. If we adopt through, let's say, through the municipal code and incorporate it into the zoning ordinance, then each time we wanted to make that change from 4 feet to 5 feet or 2 feet to 3, then we'd have to go back and update the zoning ordinance specifically through a vote by the planning commission, and then a vote by the city council, then 30 days, for the ordinance to become effective, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it's harder when you are adopting by ordinance to make changes because they apply citywide. And so we'd have to do a citywide notice in the newspaper, and a number of other things that when we do things by ordinance have to be known to the public with ample time for them to adjust their plans.
Well, I noticed when I looked in the City of Pleasanton website, they have objective standards they adopted last year. That was done by a resolution, so.
Right. I think Walnut Creek was an example that we've kind of internally talked about. They've amended it 4, maybe 5 times since they first adopted, just seeing as they're going through this process, needing to update or amend things that, in hindsight, needed to have some more flexibility or change.
Okay, thank you.
And just to build on that, also, as was mentioned earlier, if someone wants to deviate from objective standards, they can go through a discretionary process.
Right.
So.
And we love discretion.
I do have one question. Or
Good.
does the schedule allow time for the ARB to be involved in the process? Because I think I'm feeling very comfortable about 3 feet and 5 feet and 4 feet, but those guys tend to live in that world. Does the schedule allow for either them on their own or perhaps them with a joint meeting to include
It
them?
does. We've haven't talked through bringing these to the ARB, but if we find that there's value when we get to a point where they're in draft form, perhaps it would be a good opportunity to provide it to them in a study session format and have them provide some feedback and suggestions that would make it into the final draft that the planning commission sees.
Takes the pressure on of us knowing whether 3 feet or 4 feet's the right number.
Right.
So just one final, so is there like a best practice or general guidelines that other cities use that the 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, whatever it is, have already been kind of like, that's typically what most cities are utilizing so that we're not the ones trying to guess. So we can say, hey, Pleasanton just went through this, or Walnut Creek, and this is the general standards that people are using within their cities, as opposed to, why don't we just try to go from a blank slate and do it on our own because we have a better way to do it or something like that?
Yes. So there is best planning practice, design practices. There are a multitude of a good starting point is to look at what is currently required.
Mhm.
What are you currently requiring and build off of that. But certainly, there are, we talk about widths of sidewalks and what is a good floor plate height to facilitate residential versus commercial. So there are those. It's the specifics that what does San Ramon want is where we can further tweak that. But at a minimum, we will work with staff to provide what we feel is appropriate, and then we'll rely on community feedback, your input, to further refine those.
Great, thank you.
Okay, if we have no other comments or questions, thank you very much. We'll now move on to item number 12.2, which is another study session on Assembly Bill 1397. I guess, Mr. Barr, you're going to do this?
I am up. Yes. So just a quick introduction. In January 2018, Assembly Bill 1397 went into effect. And it amended housing element law that and provided for a use by right provision or approval process for specific sites that provide at least 20% affordable units to lower income. The city, as part of our housing element update, adopted Program 15 in response to AB 1397 and committed to a by right process for qualifying projects. So back in February of this year, staff provided a memo to City Council and to the Planning Commission outlining the city's response to AB 1397 as well as an approval process. The memo includes some context related to architectural review applications for objective standards, the not a project provisions under CEQA, density bonus concessions and waivers, the relationship to the inclusionary housing ordinance, also the limitations on conditions of approval. And then we also included a reference to the 100% affordable rental housing fee waiver. In addition, we provided some references in the memo about the commitment from staff to post the materials on the city's website, on the housing project website, in order to provide public notice of potential projects for those that are subscribed to that. And so really, this is an informational item, no actions required, but we open it up to the commission for discussion and questions.
Okay, who wants to go first? Anybody want to go first? I see heads, at least one head going left to right instead of up and down. Mr. Barr's here. We can't let him go without answering questions. Commissioner Alpert, do you have any? I have some, so don't feel you have to.
I just had one, but I think, so under the memo back in February, it does say the city is required to grant qualifying projects with the 4 incentives and unlimited number of waivers. So do I take that to mean that whatever waivers they ask, the city is required to grant them, or how does that get evaluated?
There's a obligation, well, the legislation shifted the responsibility to the city to demonstrate that that concession or waiver isn't necessary for the project to be financially feasible or to meet standards. And so it's a high bar and it's difficult to make, but it would have to be something that was really very obvious that it did not result in cost savings or efficiency for the project.
Okay. And then I don't know, I'm not sure if this is a concession or just an ask, but if the applicant requests that, for instance, fees and impact fees are waived entirely, is the city obligated to grant those as well?
No, the reference to our fee waiver is a very specific standard that was adopted by the city council that relates to only 100% affordable projects. The impact fees and things like that are established by ordinance and applicable, and they're objective in nature.
Okay, great. Thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you.
I might also add to that is that some of the impact fees are not city fees. So the city has no power to reduce or eliminate those.
Got it.
So the purpose of my understanding being basically not that small, but still understand. So if a project is giving 20% affordable units, they can use this uses by right. Approval process.
It depends on the site itself, whether it was well, it's outlined in the memo itself. They're legacy sites for prior housing element cycles. And so there's a couple different criteria that can be met there. And so if they qualify as a previous housing opportunity site, that has been carried over and they provide the affordability, they qualify.
And so, and then we talk about community development department, what's that?
That's planning and building.
All called for.
No, that's, oh, you mean housing and community development?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's well, community development in the reference to our posting is the city's community development. There's also housing and community development, which is a state agency.
So what's the housing department involvement with this?
The housing, well, state housing and community development, they're the ones that certify our housing element. And so they also are monitoring progress in implementing our programs. The reference, I believe, in the first paragraph.
Yes, right here, but the community development department can enhance transparency.
Yes.
and keep the public. So how do you, this is referring to you guys?
Yes.
Okay, so how do you enhance transparency?
Well, as we mentioned, we are posting to our webpage. That's something that is available. People can subscribe to it. It's something we've committed to as part of the preliminary housing development applications. And so we've added this. This is not a specific category that's in the preliminary housing development, but it's something worth posting so people know about it.
Commissioner Curtis? Okay, I had a question. I'm going to start with the public transparency issue, and I'm glad that Mr. City Attorney is down here because about 2 years ago, the commission and staff worked out an agreement whereby prior to a project, residential project being declared consistent with our city standards, there would be a hearing at which time the applicant could come in front of us at a public hearing and explain the project so the commissioners could ask questions about the project. With respect to the by right procedure that's outlined in the memo, is there anything in AB 1397 that precludes the city from having a public hearing on a project that is subject to by right approval?
Do you want to start or you want me to?
Well, AB 1397 does say that it's a non-discretionary decision. So as such, and it does reference CEQA as whether it's non-discretionary under CEQA. CEQA lists several uses, or excuse me, several decisions that are considered to be non-discretionary, including issuance of building permits, issuing of business licenses, approval of final subdivision maps, approval of individual utility service connections and disconnections. None of which require planning commission purview. So what we would have to explain to the state is why are we treating other non-discretionary permits differently than this one?
Well, I would go a step further in saying it's not just a matter of planning commission review. It doesn't require a public hearing period, whether that's before the zoning administrator or any other body. And so as a ministerial project, you're kicking it into a different area to do a public hearing.
No, I understand that it doesn't require a public hearing, but there's a difference between not requiring one and having one anyway. And all the points that you raised are really irrelevant to what I was asking about, which was to have a public hearing where the project could be disclosed to the public. I do subscribe to the website link that you're talking about. I suspect there's very few people in the city that do. And I would also suspect that if there were a public hearing, it would be published in the Patch, in the San Ramon Danville Express. There would be a wider circulation of a particular project than simply by having someone troll through the city's website and figure out what the project list is. So I understand it's not required, but we do things all the time that are not required. And in the connection of public transparency, it seems to me that a public hearing, even though we don't get to make decisions, we're just introducing the project to the public, would be a much better way of schooling the public on what's happening. And what I've announced, when I brought this up before, my concern is that even though it provides for by right approval, which simply means that it is, everyone has to run it through on objective standards. There's no discretion, although I don't think that's accurate. But, you know, there's a difference between doing it that way and actually having the public know about what's happening. My fear has always been that when we do a by right approval, the first time most of the public will find out about it is when the bulldozer shows up at the project site. And so my question is there anything that prevents us from having a non-decision-making public hearing on a project that is subject to by right approval?
Um,
Now, again, there's a difference between no, we're not prevented from doing so, but we think that it is not appropriate for that type of hearing. There's a difference between the two, and if the position is it's really not appropriate, that's a different issue.
Well, I would argue the decision to hold a public hearing for one project versus another that's ministerial in nature is discretion. And so it creates a problem in moving forward. Because again, how do you decide which projects are subject to a non-decision public hearing? Again, that's an arbitrary standard in terms of how you decide.
Well, there's a simple way to do this, and that is you have in any of your ministerial applications, whether the applicant would like to come in voluntarily and have a public hearing on what they're proposing to do. That way you leave it up to the applicant to make that decision and you're not forcing them to do it.
They already have that opportunity through the concept review, and you've seen several of those in the last year and a half.
Okay, so that's what you're relying on for that aspect of public transparency.
Again, it's voluntary on the part of the applicant.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll see how that goes in the future. The staff report refers to 20% for a set aside for lower income units. Now, there's about 4 different levels of income brackets. There's extremely low, there's very low, there's low and moderate. In terms of AB 1397, does a person that would fall into the moderate income category, do they fall into the type of bracket that would allow for by right approval?
I don't believe so. I believe it's low and very low.
Okay, okay. And you mentioned this to Commissioner Ahmed, that just because someone walks in with a 20% project doesn't automatically mean they're subject to by right approval. It's really based upon the history of the particular property in question, whether they're on our housing cycles, 4th and 5th. And the one thing I saw that I didn't see a description of in the staff report is this. One of the requirements, as I understand it, for triggering by right approval is that the property has to be zoned at a certain density to allow for lower income development. In other words, if you had hypothetically a project of say 6 to 12 units that probably doesn't meet the classification, what's the cutoff? Is it 20 or 30?
I believe it's 20, Cindy. 20.
Is it 20? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Then I had a comment about the review process. And that is this. The staff report refers to architectural review. It specifically calls out section D6-22 of the zoning ordinance for that. Now, I've read that section a few times, including today. And that section has absolutely nothing to do with the by right approval process. D6-22 refers to architectural review by the Architectural Review Board, and the purpose of that whole section is listed as, quote, the purpose of architectural review is to recognize the interdependence of land values and aesthetics and to provide a method to promote sound land use development. And if you read through that section, what it does is it talks about things to make the project look better. There is nothing objective at all in that section. You're trying to do a ministerial approval based on objective design standards, and that's not what that particular section does. So my question to you is, if you're going to do by right approval, why not provide something in the zoning ordinance that in fact does that? Because D6-22 doesn't do that.
You're talking about creating a new permit class?
Yes, yes, by right approval, it says, if you are eligible for by right approval of your project, here's the steps to take place. But what you're doing in the staff memo is you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole because it doesn't at all apply to D6-22.
Well, I would probably argue that there's a slight disconnect between what state law says in terms of architectural review for objective standards versus what our standards say, and which are not objective standards.
Right.
And so
that-
again, the category of architectural review is specifically acknowledged in state law, but then it limits it to objective standards. And so that's where you raise a good point. But it's something that we have to come to terms with, and whether that's the right tool or not, we can revisit that.
Okay, well, my point was not to try and get you, well, it was to change it, but my point was there's a disconnect between the zoning ordinance section and what you're trying to do for by right approval. I wanted to raise that, not that I'm trying to create more work for attorneys, but that's something that I think the city needs to look at seriously, because the way it's structured now, it doesn't make any sense at all. So, last question. Conditions of approval. Now, the first question is every housing project that's subject to by right approval going to be subject to exactly the same conditions of approval?
Most likely, yes, but it may depend on where they are in the city. I guess the legal term would be it depends. Again, there's the ability to measure against objective standards. Some areas have them, some don't, some have different ones. And so you have to look at it a little bit in the context of where the project is. But generally speaking, the conditions of approval associated with this type of application are going to be basically reminders of everything that's already in the municipal code, existing standards. It's not something where we can come in and ask for things to happen. It's pointing out that grading permits are required, that stormwater compliance is required, that nesting birds surveys are required. Those are all things that are existing regulations in place that often get lost in a applicant's desire to build their project.
No, I understand most of what you're saying. The reason I brought it up was that, as you know, we have had projects where we've had at least 188 conditions of approval. The first part of the 188 is standard conditions of approval, and there will then be 55 special conditions of approval, because not every project is the same. As you point out, they're built in different areas of the city. There's different things that go with them. And so that's why we have special conditions of approval. And what I'm getting to is this: unless everybody gets exactly the same conditions of approval, if you have to decide whether condition 45 really applies to this particular project, and whether, because of the project's location, we need to create something that deals with a specific issue on that project that is not common to every other project in the city, you are using your discretion on conditions of approval. Now, my understanding is that under the Housing Accountability Act, that's okay, that you can have subjective conditions of approval as long as they don't prevent the project from being completed. So I am really interested in seeing how you deal with that problem, particularly since we have in the pipeline, one for by right approval already. But it seems to me that that's an issue about whether you're going to exercise that's discretion for conditions of approval that probably needs to be looked at as well.
Through the chair, I can give an example of how it might vary. For example, some projects might be in proximity to earthquake fault zones. And there are very specific requirements in our code and in state law that apply, that are objective in nature and in terms of applicability. We would not need to include a condition that tells someone that they need to do a fault line study if they're not in a fault zone. So it's not a subjective decision. They're either in the zone or they're not, but we are going to remind them of the obligations to do the fault line studies as part of their development review process. Even if we didn't include that condition, it would still come up as part of the building plan check. but we're giving them a heads up and a reminder to streamline the process.
So, having sat through conditions of approval for 15 years, I know that there are tweaks that have to be done because of the property. Last question. For by right approval, how does the planning commission get notified when a project has been approved?
There's no process in place currently to notify the commission,
Okay.
other than weekly updates that we provide to the
Okay.
council.
So there is the by right approval subject to the same appeal provisions as a regular discretionary project.
I believe it is.
Okay, so if there's no procedure for
excuse me.
notifying,
Sorry, let me clarify.
Yeah.
It's subject to the appeal provisions of the architectural review application.
the application,
Well, right, there are different appeal procedures related to different types of applications. And so a ministerial decision from a staff member on an architectural review application has one process versus a planning commission approval has a different process of appeal.
well, I know that there in the zoning ordinance, there are decisions that can be made by the zoning administrator that are subject to a call for review by the planning commission. But in order to have that timely, planning commission needs to know that decision's been made in the first place, which is why I asked you how we would get notification of a decision on a by right approval.
I guess my question is, what would be the grounds for an appeal of a ministerial action?
Well, the answer to your question is without having seen the project, you're asking me a hypothetical question that I can't answer without seeing the facts. But you're assuming that every approval is bulletproof and no one can appeal it. And I will tell you that anybody can appeal anything.
Well, I'll defer to the city attorney, but building permits are appealable as well. And so there's a process there that they can go through. Again, we don't provide notice of home additions to people. We don't let the commission know that we've approved a tenant improvement. So again, picking and choosing who we provide notice to is a difficult thing to do. We have project lists and we have standard notifications. Every building permit, there's a list of every building permit that's issued in the city, and contractors come and get those things. We have a current project list that we update. We also have this new web page. So if there's something in there, you can monitor it that way and seek to get information from staff through that process.
Okay. Do you want to add to our conversation, Mr. City Attorney?
I really don't have anything to add. I thought that was a complete answer.
Okay. All right. All right. Anybody else have any comments? All right. That's the end of item number 12.2. Let's go on to liaison reports. Do we have any of those? Okay. I have two. I attended the Open Space Committee meeting on March 18th. Short version is that the plan for the Open Space Committee is to have 4 hikes a year, 2 in the spring, 2 in the fall, and 2 non-hike events, like the Art and Wind Festival, and also they had a well-attended public showing of a photographer's and a hiker's work, I think in February of this year. Then on the 21st, I attended the TAC meeting. We had another scintillating discussion of city finances by our deputy city manager. Then we have one of our all-time favorites, Brown Act training by Ms. Poon. And I know we had a discussion about signs today, but the city is looking at doing is instead of spending money for speed bumps as far as a traffic calming device, what you're thinking about doing is to purchase speed signs that when you go past them, it tells you how fast you're going. Apparently, there are some studies that show those are very effective at modulating people's speed through areas, particularly as a residential neighborhood. And the cost of them is incredibly lower than putting in a speed bump or things like that. So more bang for your buck, so to speak. So your city dollars at work. Mr. Barr, what's on the schedule for the next couple of meetings?
All right, so for the next meeting, April 16th, we are coming back with the retail analysis information to look at the non-retail percentages and standards for commercial centers. We also have a use permit and parking reduction proposal for Bishop Ranch 15 for medical office uses. And we're also working to schedule Avalon Bay, which is Bishop Ranch 3A, sometime in hopefully May.
All right, anybody else have any comments, questions? Seeing no hands raised, this meeting is adjourned.